Hello everyone, welcome back to another historical knitting video, or mostly historical sewing, but some knitting will be involved. This is going to be part one of me making a 1890s petticoat for my 1892 outfit. If you've been following along so far, you'll know that I'm trying to hand make and mostly hand knit an entire 1892 outfit. So far I finished stockings, combinations, the trimming for my corset, an underskirt, a bustle pad, and now I'm going to make a petticoat to go over all of that. It wasn't part of my original plan actually to make this petticoat, but I got some really great feedback in the comments on my previous videos that it would be a really good idea for me to make one, and after doing some more research, I completely agree. I think it's absolutely needed in order to make the right silhouette for an 1890s outfit. And I just want to say thank you so much for the people who are giving me fantastic feedback and advice and asking some great questions. If you guys have any more information or any more pieces of advice for me, feel free to leave me comments. I am learning so much and I really want to thank you all. In order to get some inspiration for what I wanted this petticoat to look like, I decided to go back to the fashion catalog that I've been referencing from the winter and fall of 1890 and 1891. And in it I found some amazing examples of petticoats. One in particular really stuck out to me. A lot of them were very similar styles, but it had this row of tucks and then a set of insertion lace, some more tucks, and then a lace trim at the bottom. So my idea is to sew the petticoat and then knit those lace insertions and lace trimmings. In order to see if that was something that was kind of common at the time, I decided to look at examples, and I found one particular example from the time frame on the Met's website, and I found a ton of examples of about the same 1890s time frame petticoats on Etsy, and I think some of them look like they might have had hand knit or hand crocheted lace trims as well. So now when it comes to actually finding a pattern or making a pattern for the petticoat, I decided I wouldn't try to draft or drape my own pattern for the petticoat. I barely got the yoke done for my underskirt. So I decided to turn to Truly Victorian's TV170, which is actually 4 separate petticoat patterns in one that kind of span a really wide range of the Victorian era, including the 1890s petticoat that I'm looking for. And that actually looks really close to what I'm aiming for. It's just that they only have one set of tucks and then a lace ruffle at the bottom versus what I said before. I want the tucks, lace insertion, tucks, and then the lace trim. Then for the lace, I'm actually going to turn back to the reference I've been using this whole time, which is my original 1892 copy of The Art of Knitting, which is just full of great historical knitting patterns. And at the beginning, it's absolutely full of lace insertions and lace trims. So I picked out an insertion and a trim that I really wanted to do. So like I mentioned before, I don't get to a lot of knitting in this video, but I did want to share my progress so far because I'm pretty excited with how this looks. I've been working on the knitting already, and I've been working on it for about the past 2 weeks, so I'm not exactly sure how long it'll take me to finish because I'm only about halfway done, but hopefully it won't take me too long for the second part of this video to come out and for me to actually finish the petticoat. In any case, let's get started. I decided to buy the electronic version of the pattern, which meant that I printed it out on quite a few sheets of paper, and each sheet of paper had a different part of the pattern on it, which meant that I then had to lay it out and tape it all together. This did end up taking me quite some time to tape all the pieces together to the 2 separate pattern pages, or overall pattern sheets. I think it was about an hour, but an hour was faster than the few days of time it would have taken to ship the physical pattern to my apartment. Just in case you're wondering, yes, I am working on the floor, and actually I'll be doing this entire project on the floor, at least the sewing portion of it, because it's the largest surface area that I have in my apartment. Here you can see that I'm starting to work on the second set of pattern pages, which also requires laying out all the sheets of paper and then taping them together before actually cutting out the pattern pieces. Something that you also may have noticed on the first set of pattern pages that I was doing is that I actually highlight the lines that I'm planning on cutting on before I cut out the pieces. This is to make sure that when I kind of zone out while I'm cutting, that I still am following the right set of instructions, because there are 4 different sets of petticoat instructions on this one pattern. I also use a little bit of extra tape to reinforce those pieces that I think might be a little bit weak when I'm taping together the pieces here. You can see that I'm trying to reinforce it a little bit because once I start cutting, some of the pieces of tape that I used to assemble the pattern won't be reinforcing those parts anymore. After finishing cutting out my pattern pieces, I decided to transfer them directly onto the final fabric that I would be using for the petticoat, which is a really nice off-white cotton. I know that it's typical, really, to make a mock-up first, but I was hoping that with the waistband being a drawstring, that it would be forgiving enough that if something didn't fit quite right, that I could still make it work in the end. It did end up working out in hindsight, but that was a very kind of big assumption to make, I think, for a project this size. So in the future, I think it might have been better to actually make a mock-up first, especially since I'm very, very new to sewing, and it would have allowed me to practice some techniques before doing the actual completely brand new to me sewing techniques on my final piece. After finishing cutting out all the different pieces of fabric, I decided to lay it all out as best as I could just to make sure that I had all the pieces together that I would need. You can see that I'm working with quite limited space here, but I'm doing the best I can with what I have. Now it's time to get to the actual assembly instructions, which begin by telling me to sew all the darts, which the front and side panels all have darts. What you're seeing here is going to be the first set of darts I'm ever sewing in my entire life, and I don't think that they're perfect, but I actually do think that they turned out half decently thanks to a bunch of YouTube tutorial videos that I followed. As I mentioned, they're not the best darts in the world, but I'm pretty darn proud of my first 2 darts ever. I continue this process for each of the side panels to just finish making all of the darts. And here you can see all the finished darts for the front and side panels. I'm not sure if I got better with each subsequent attempt, but I'm pretty happy with how they look overall. The next step in the instructions is actually starting to assemble the top part of the petticoat. So here you can see that I'm pinning the front section to the side sections using my trusty ball of yarn as a pincushion. I do apologize for not getting better assembly footage here because it's a little hard to tell what I'm doing, but at this point I'm actually sewing the front panel to each of the side panels. And then there are 2 back panels that I then attach to each side panel as well. Before sewing together the 2 back panels, I'm marking a line 8 inches down from the top, and this is where I won't be sewing the back panels together to allow for a bit of an opening where the drawstring will go at the top to allow me to actually pull this petticoat on over my hips. And the top part of the petticoat is assembled. The 1 front panel, 2 side panels, and 2 back panels all stitched together except for the 8-inch opening at the top of the back panels. Next up was sewing together the 4 panels that make up the bottom part of the petticoat. This created one long continuous loop of fabric, which was quite a lot of fabric. Here you can see that I'm marking out where the tucks need to go on this bottom portion of the petticoat. I followed the instructions and I did the tucks after sewing together the bottom portion of the petticoat into one long tube. Although, looking back on it, I don't know if it would have been easier to do it before I sewed the pieces together because it was just a whole lot of fabric to work with all at once. However, maybe doing the tucks after you sew the pieces together is the correct way of doing the sewing, but I just went back and I did the calculation, and each panel is 44 inches wide, which means that there is over 14.5 feet of fabric here that I had to create into tucks and then run through the sewing machine all at once. Alright, so there's 5 total tucks that I have to create. Let's get sewing. And the 5 tucks are now complete. I will admit that my lines are quite wobbly and sometimes the spacing is really uneven, but overall I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out, and I think that the tucks really start to come alive when I start ironing them flat. Although it does really point out how uneven some of my lines are. Oh well. The next step is to gather the top of the flounces in order to create that nice volume in the petticoat itself. Here you can see that I'm trying out the gathering technique. For the first time, I'm actually trying it out first on a scrap bit of fabric rather than on the finished piece, just because I am very uncertain how this will actually work and if my thread is strong enough to withstand the pulling for the gathering bit of this. But as you can see, it's actually working out quite well, and I think that the gathers turned out pretty nice. Now it's time to actually gather the top of the flounce. So once again, I'm putting the 14.5 feet of fabric through the machine, and I'm doing 2 parallel top stitches where I don't do back stitches at the top. I ended up actually creating it in 2 separate sections, so I gather it in 2 separate directions just because I thought that doing all of it at once in one gather would be too tough. So you can see here that now I'm done with gathering all of it, which is, to be honest, quite frustrating. The thread broke quite a few times. I had to unpick it, but I did finish, and I was able to sew the bottom flounce to the top half of the petticoat, as you can see that I'm doing here. Unfortunately, I didn't film much of the rest of the construction of the skirt. I think it was because I did get a little frustrated at this point, but I managed to assemble the petticoat, and you can see here the flounce with the tucks and gathered at the top was attached to the top part of the petticoat, and I also added a waistband. The top part of the petticoat was also gathered before attaching it to the waistband, and that kind of gives it the nice fullness at the back. I did not sew very straight lines when attaching all of this, and when I put the drawstring in, I didn't actually feed it through. I already had it in the skirt waistband because I knew I'd get too frustrated at that point trying to push it all the way through. But I did manage to assemble everything, and here you can see the finished first part of the petticoat, which is most of the sewing done. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out overall. There are so many mistakes that I made and so many different things that I wish I would have done better, but getting to twirl in this petticoat is one of the funnest things I have ever done. This is the first actual wearable piece of clothing that I've sewn, so this is a really exciting moment for me, even if it could use a lot of improvements. I am wearing all of the other pieces that I've made for this outfit so far, including the mostly knit underskirt, as well as the bustle pad, which gives it that extra nice volume at the back. One of the biggest places that I could see where I could improve is making sure that my sewing lines are much more straight and even, especially because it's incredibly visible how uneven my lines are on these tucks, as well as making sure that my gathers are a little bit more consistent, especially across the top of this ruffle. However, I think that most of the mistakes, while visible, aren't too glaring, and I really like how this skirt feels on. What's left for me to do is to finish knitting the lace insertion and lace trim, which I'm working on here, and attach that to the petticoat. It's taken me about 2 weeks to get halfway, so I'm hoping it's not going to be too much longer before I finish and can show you part 2, but the other complication is actually that I'm moving. And one of the reasons I'm moving is because I just don't have enough room in my apartment. Like I said, I spent most of this project working on the floor, which wasn't exactly the best for my poor back and shoulders. So I'm really excited to get a little bit more space for myself, my dog, and my sewing projects. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like. If you'd like to see more videos like this, you can subscribe to my channel, where I will hopefully come out with the second part of this video as soon as I finish knitting and moving. I can't wait to see you all again.